Hey peeps, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and today I'm joined by Dr. David Builes to discuss the metaphysics of persistence, laws of nature, existential inertia, and so much more. We'll be focusing in particular on a paper that David and his co-author, Trevor Title, published a few months ago in the journal Philosophical Perspectives. The paper is titled Lawful Persistence. You guys can check it out in the description. I will link it down there. I quite enjoyed the paper, and its conclusions are pretty significant. And also, I appreciated the paper's connection to the existential inertia debate, which, as my audience knows, I have published a lot on, and I've done a lot on my channel on. So anyway, thanks, David, for coming on, and maybe you could tell the audience just a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. So I am an assistant professor at Princeton University, and I work on a lot of different things, but my main two areas are metaphysics and epistemology. And within metaphysics, I've done a lot of different things, including stuff about time, consciousness, laws of nature, causality, ontology, abstract objects, and a lot of other things. And epistemology, I've mainly worked on sort of formal epistemology, more specifically Bayesian epistemology, and lots of different things about precise credences and imprecise credences and self-locating probabilities and chance and lots of other things. So yeah, that's me.
Awesome. And for the audience, I will put David's website and with links to his papers and stuff in the description. A lot of them are pretty fun. So before we dig into the nitty-gritty details of the paper, can you give an audience basically a sense of the paper's general goal, like essentially a bird's eye view and maybe like a taste of the paper's payoffs or its significance?
Yeah, so basically there's two models for how things persist through time that philosophers have developed. And the goal of the paper is to try to make progress on which of these two models is correct. And the way we do that is we see how these two models might try to secure this, what we think of as an attractive view about the laws of nature. And it turns out that very different things happen when you try to secure this view about laws, depending on which view about persistence you have. So in particular, one view, namely perdurantism, seems like the only way to get at this view is to adopt this pretty unpopular view known as anti-hexaetism. But it turns out endurantism has a lot of different options. So if you don't like anti-hexaetism, you might like endurantism. And yeah, so that's what we're doing. I could also say about why you should care.
Yeah.
So obviously the first reason is you might just be intrinsically interested in how things persist through time. Obviously, persistence is a very general, ubiquitous feature of our world. Our world would be a very different world if things didn't persist. You know, if my mug didn't keep on existing the next second, things would be very different. But even if you don't care about persistence, debates about persistence have lots of other ramifications in other areas of philosophy. So one area is more general debates about the nature of time. So there's also sort of two big models for how to think about time. On one view, time is kind of like space, and the world is this four-dimensional thing with 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time. And the other kind of model thinks the world's not like that time is very different than space, there's an objectively privileged present, etc. And a lot of philosophers have thought that these two different models of persistence are naturally tied with corresponding views in these different models of time. So in particular, the sort of spatializing view of time goes with the kind of perdurantism, and the non-spatializing view goes with endurantism. And yeah, why should you care about time? Obviously, time is interesting, but also time has implications elsewhere as well. So, for example, throughout philosophy of religion, there's lots of arguments that seem to hinge on these view of time. So some people think that, like, the Kalam cosmological argument might depend on these views of time, what you think about God and foreknowledge, and whether God is in time and outside of time. So lots of different things hinge on time. And so one way to get a grip on these questions about time is to try to make progress on persistence.
Absolutely. So for the audience, we've been using some terms like endurantism and perdurantism, and so that's what we're getting on to. In this next portion of the video, we are defining our terms, or at least we're explicating them and clarifying them or ostending them, because maybe we can't define them. But so so let's get into the key terms now. So I think we'll broadly focus on 4 for the audience, just to give them a bird's eye view, and then we'll go into each in particular. So the first one is persistence, and we're going to look at endurantism and perdurantism. The second broad term that we want to look at is modality, and the different modalities. So possibility and necessity, as well as like what's the difference between metaphysical possibility and logical possibility and gnomic possibility, because that's kind of important for your paper. Thirdly, we're going to be looking at like what is a law of nature, and what are like the two main views therein in the debate about laws of nature. And then finally, we're going to look at the distinction between qualitative and non-qualitative and how that relates to like this fancy term, hexaity. So we'll get into all that for the audience. So that's this next portion of the video, the key terms. Okay, so starting with persistence. Yeah, as you point out, like persistence, things continue to exist through time in some manner. Now, there are at least two relevant questions I think we should disentangle. The first one is like, how do things persist, or like in what manner do they persist? And then the next one is like, why do things persist? Like what explains why things continue to exist rather than being annihilated or replaced by like qualitative duplicates at any moment of their lives? So within that how do things persist question, that first question, we've got endurantism and perdurantism. So do you want to say a little bit about those for the audience?
Yeah, so endurantism, so yeah, both of these views are like things manage to exist at multiple times. But there's a question, how do you manage to exist at multiple times? Endurantism says you manage to exist at multiple times by being wholly present at each time. So the whole of you is present at each time. Perdurantism says, no, you manage to exist at different times because different parts of you exist at different times. So on the perdurance view, there's like these four-dimensional extended view things in space and time. And the reason they manage to exist at multiple times is because they have different parts that exist at different times. And the endurantist says that's not how things persist through different times. The whole of them exists at each time. So I think a neat example of this is the following. So imagine a world with a single particle just going in a straight line. That's the whole world. So ask the endurantist, how many material objects are there? The endurantist will say one. There's just one particle that exists at each time. Now ask the perdurantist, how many material objects are there? They will say not one, infinitely many, because they'll think that at each time there's this slice of a particle, and there's all these distinct slices, and so there's infinitely many times, so there's infinitely many particle slices. So that's basically the two different models.
Mm-hmm. And just for the audience, one thing that's interesting is that the perdurantist, if they adopt a discrete view of time, they might say that it's a very, very, very large number of material objects in this world, but maybe it's not infinitely many, if we don't have these like infinitesimal slices, as it were. So that's just a little thing for the audience, because I know some people in my audience might thereby just reject perdurantism because they don't like actual infinities, because as you mentioned, the Kalam cosmological argument. So now I'm totally cool with them, but yeah, okay. So yeah, we got those two questions. You just talked about how do things persist, and later on we'll be asking this question of why things persist. But at least for the audience, it's crucial to keep these distinct. Like the question of how do things persist, how do they manage to exist at multiple moments of their lives, is different from the question of like, well then, like, given that they do exist at multiple points in their lives, like why is that? Like what explains that? Why don't they just annihilate? And of course, in my book, like I talk about like existential inertia and different metaphysical accounts of existential inertia, and we go through different explanations, and you actually touch on some that are pretty interestingly similar, but we'll get to that. Okay, the next question is modality, or the next key term is modality, and we're looking in particular at possibility and necessity and different kinds of possibility and necessity. So in your paper, it definitely comes up multiple times, the distinction between metaphysical modality, so like metaphysical possibilities and necessities, versus gnomic modality, so like gnomic possibilities and gnomic necessities. And I also think it's helpful for the audience to distinguish both of these also from logical modality, or maybe narrowly logical modality. So if you could kind of help give our audience a sense of these distinctions, that would be greatly appreciated. So I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, so these are obviously very philosophically loaded distinctions, and people understand them in different ways, but we can gloss them. So yeah, so nominalogical modality is basically what's physically necessary, or what is consistent with the laws of nature and what is not. So take the claim that nothing can go faster than the speed of light. That's nominologically necessary. So the laws of physics entail that nothing can go faster than the speed of light. But it's at least an open philosophical question whether it's metaphysically possible that things can go faster than the speed of light. Probably the orthodox view is that the laws of nature are not themselves metaphysically necessary, and so they're metaphysically possible worlds with other laws of nature. So for example, maybe Newtonian worlds are metaphysically possible, and in Newtonian worlds, things can go arbitrarily fast, and so things could go faster than the speed of light if there are metaphysically possible Newtonian worlds. So most people think of as nominological modality as a sort of restricted modality, where you restrict the world to the worlds that have the same laws of nature. And metaphysical modality is supposed to be totally unrestricted. So it's not restricted by the laws of nature. And it's sort of, if you think that metaphysical modality and nomological modality coincide, that's a very substantive thing that you have to argue for, because it seems prima facie possible that, say, a Newtonian world could be actual.
Yeah. As I understand, like, as I try to help people see like metaphysical modality, I usually give, well, firstly, examples, but also it's basically like an absolute, like the broadest, most absolute sense in which something really could be, like really objectively could be in reality. Could it be actual? Could it be? You could think of it in terms of actualizability in some sense, or like, could this thing really obtain in reality? That's sort of how I think about it. It's hard because there's like a primitive modal operator, or the primitive modal term there is could, but I surmise that we all have a kind of intuitive sense. And even though there might be no strict logical contradiction in, let's say, a prime number causally producing a prime minister, nevertheless, most people think that really couldn't happen. And so it's metaphysically impossible, even though it's logically possible in the sense of being like strictly logically consistent. There's no like formal logical contradiction that you can derive from that in some like language of logic or something like that.
Exactly. And logic, there's this weird, like, logical possibility is always relative to the particular logical system you're working with. There's logical possibility according to first order logic and second order logic and free logic and whatever. And like, so it's technically, it's logically necessary that something exists in first order logic, which is this very weird thing. I mean, but it's obviously very philosophically controversial whether there, could be absolutely nothing. But, we shouldn't decide the metaphysics just by, this logical quirk of first order logic. So that's also something to say about logical.
Yeah, good. Okay, so that's modality. And then laws of nature. So basically, we all hear this term laws of nature, but like before I got into philosophy, so like a long while back, I always heard that and I never knew what it was. I was like, what are laws of, like, what are you guys talking? Like a law? Like, is there some sort of like, are there like these ghostly things that are like governing? I was like, what is a law? Like I hear scientists talk about it, but no one ever defines it. And, you ask scientists and usually they're just like, shut up and calculate. So, yeah. So what is a law of nature? And then how does it like, how do we distinguish between humanism and non-humanism? So I'll turn it over to you for these.
Yeah. So scientists are supposed to tell you like what are the laws of nature, like is it Newton's laws or Maxwell's laws or something, but they never really tell you what it is to be a law of nature in the first place. They just like use this label and people don't know. And because scientists don't tell you, like philosophers have a million different views about what they are. And I guess you can distinguish them. Yeah, I mean, the great divide is between Humeans and non-Humeans. So Humeans have this very deflationary view about laws, that there's nothing really metaphysically special about laws. They're just claims about reality like any other claims, but that happen to be very simple and informative. So like I can say like tables exist and cows exist or whatever. And I could also say like F equals ma and Maxwell's equation. And there's nothing like metaphysically distinct from those two different claims. They're just one tells you a lot about the world, that for all times, force equals mass times acceleration or whatever. But don't read too much into it. There's no ghostly entities governing things, and there's no like glue making the past, evolve into the future. But the non-Humeans take laws more seriously. And there's actually different ways to do this. One is to take laws themselves very seriously as sort of sui generis, primitive kinds of things. And so in addition to like particles and tables and chairs, you believe in these entities' laws, and these entities are supposed to somehow make the future into what it is, given the past. Some people don't think laws as entities, some kind of primitive operator or whatever, but anyway, I'll put that aside. So anyway, so some people just take laws as primitive, and other non-Humeans don't. Well, what did they say? One popular option is the sort of, we shouldn't think that what's driving the world is this spooky, ghostly thing sort of outside of the universe or something. We should think that what's driving the universe are the things down here. So like that actual like particles or whatever have causal powers that sort of necessitate that the future go in certain ways. So like what's sort of driving things onward is the sort of causal powers that things possess. And when scientists are talking about laws, they're really sort of an indirect way of talking about sort of the causal powers of particular physical objects. Like massive things have the causal power to attract other massive things and resist acceleration and things like that. And then there's this other view that's a bit more technical, this Dretske, Tooley, Armstrong view, where you try to say that laws are relations between universals, where universals is this technical philosophical jargon for a particular kind of property. So take the property of having a certain mass. You might think there's a universal corresponding to that property that is sort of wholly present wherever all the massive things are. And some people try to explain these law-like connections between fundamental properties by certain relations between those universals. Those are the main non-Humean accounts.
Yeah, that's good. So I've heard the distinction between humanism and non-humanism, or Humean accounts and non-Humean accounts, be like cashed out in different ways. So I think Hildebrand might cash it out in terms of whether or not they posit like primitive necessities somewhere. So like the Humean accounts would not posit any primitive necessities, whereas non-Humean accounts would. I've heard other people put it in terms of like non-Humean accounts involve some sort of, they involve some sort of metaphysical oomph that is like laws govern or constrain in some manner, whereas Humean accounts deny that kind of governing or constraining behavior according to the laws. Could you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there's definitely like this family resemblance between non-Humean views and Humean views. And there's a question of exactly, is there like some sharp line that you can cleanly divide them? Yeah, one kind of view is non-Humean views have some kind of primitive necessity in the world. And I think that does distinguish most Humean views from most non-Humean views. I actually have a paper that just came out called a Humean non-Humeanism, where I develop a non-Humean view with no primitive necessities in it, but all the necessities are derivative. So that wouldn't really cash out this weird version of non-humanism I have. So I think probably the best way to think of it is some kind of family resemblance of non-Humean views and Humean views. But yeah, some kind of, it's definitely that one view has primitive necessities and the one doesn't is
Yeah.
definitely.
That's good. And then before we go on to qualitative versus non-qualitative facts and properties and things like that, just for the audience, I want to kind of sum up, like, because we went through different accounts of laws and it was, it's easy to get lost in those. So the accounts are broadly broken up into Humean and non-Humean accounts. And then within the Humean accounts, like the main one going is what's, you articulate it without, saying the term, which is totally fine. It's like the best systems analysis, or sometimes called like BSA. And the basic idea is that laws are just, these statements. I think it's like axioms that figure in our best system, the world that best manages the trade-off between simplicity and informativeness. So they're just statements in that best system or best account of the world. There's really no metaphysical glue there. There's no primitive necessity there. They're just statements like any ordinary other statement. Whereas the non-human accounts, I think you adumbrated three accounts there. One of them was the kind of primitivism, the one that you gave first, where these laws are just sui generis primitive entities that make things happen in some manner. A second account that you talked about was what we could call dispositional essentialism, where things have these causal powers and dispositions, and that's where the necessity is sourced, as it were, and that's where the governing constraining happens. And then the third one that you articulated was a kind of what philosophers call Dretske, Tooley, Armstrong account from the three primary philosophers who developed it, or the DTA account, and that's where laws of nature are something like relations of gnomic necessitation between properties. So okay, so that's the basic idea for the audience of laws of nature and the different accounts. Now we can go on to the distinction between qualitative and non-qualitative. Now there's a kind of orthogonal distinction here between the facts and the properties. So if you could kind of disentangle all this for us, and also how it relates to this crazy term hexaity, because I'm sure for most people in my audience, that's the first time they've heard this.
Yeah, this is a pretty in the weeds metaphysical debate, but I think it's actually kind of a pretty deep one, and it's going to figure in this argument. So we start with the distinction between a qualitative fact and a non-qualitative fact. And intuitively, a non-qualitative fact is a fact that is about a particular individual object, and a qualitative fact is not. So let's give some examples. Let's say, take the fact Bob is sitting. That's a non-qualitative fact because it's about a particular individual object, namely Bob. Now take the fact that someone is sitting. That's a qualitative fact because it's not about any particular individual like Bob or Alice, whatever, just as someone or other, I don't care who is sitting. So that's the rough distinction between qualitative and non-qualitative. You can make it more precise, like in first order logic. So the non-qualitative facts are the ones that have like constants that are names for particular individuals, and the qualitative facts don't have any constants that are names for individuals. So that's the distinction between a qualitative fact and a non-qualitative fact. And we can have an analogous distinction between qualitative properties and non-qualitative properties. So paradigm case of a non-qualitative property is like the property of being Joe Schmidt, for example. So that's a non-qualitative property. And a qualitative property is like being read. So anything can be read. It's not about any particular individual, but being Joe Schmidt, obviously there has to be a particular individual for something to have that property. So so that's the distinction between qualitative and non-qualitative properties. And so with that distinction on board, we can ask this question. That's the question between hexaetists and anti-hexaetists. So let's start with anti-hexaetism. So anti-hexaetism is the following view, that if you look at the space of possible worlds, you're not going to find two distinct worlds that are qualitatively exactly alike. That's what anti-hexaetism says. There's not two distinct worlds that are nonetheless qualitatively exactly alike. So basically, once you've specified the qualitative stuff, you're done. That's all there is, just specifying. And the hexaetist says, no, there are further facts over and above the qualitative stuff. So you can fully specify the qualitative stuff, like how many people exist, what shirts are they wearing, etc. But there's a further facts about which particular people exist and which particular people are wearing which particular shirts. Like it's Joe that's wearing that particular shirt and who is in wherever you are, etc. So that's the distinction. So anti-hexaetist says qualitative is all there is, and hexaetists say no, there's more than just the qualitative. So that's the debate, and that's a very abstract kind of debate. But I want to illustrate it with a particular example that gets intuitions pumping. So here's an example that I think a lot of people think is sort of a devastating counterexample to anti-hexaetism. So I'm going to describe two worlds. They're qualitatively exactly alike, but it seems obvious that they're distinct worlds. They're not the same world. So here's the description. Consider a world that has two planets in it, and both planets are perfect duplicates. Let's call them Earth and Twin Earth. So they'll be like Joe is on one and like twin Joe is on the other. And they're having twin conversations between twin Joe and twin David, etc. Okay, and there's nothing else in the world. There's just these two perfectly symmetric planets and otherwise just empty space. And now let's introduce one asymmetry. So there's these two worlds. And imagine there's a meteor that comes down and blows up one world. Now seems like two different possibilities. Either you will die. Either the meteor will kill you or it won't kill you. It will kill twin Joe. Now, those two possibilities are exactly qualitatively alike. So take the possibility where there's two symmetric planets and the meteor hits you, and take the possibility where there's two symmetric planets and the meteor hits twin Joe. Those are qualitatively exactly alike. There's two planets, they have the exact same people, a meteor hits one of them, it doesn't hit the other one, etc. So all of the qualitative facts are exactly the same. The only difference is which particular planet did it hit and which particular people did it kill? Did it kill you or did it kill your twin? And it seems kind of obvious that these are two different possibilities. So try to imagine yourself in that situation. You're like, I really don't want to die. I think I really would want the meteor to kill the other people and not me. And I think there's this difference, and it's an extremely important difference. But the anti-hexaetists will think, no, it's just an illusion to think there's two possibilities here. There's only one thing that can happen. And that seems very strange. So that's supposed to be a sort of counterexample to anti-hexaetism. And there's lots of other examples like that that try to sort of pump your intuitions where there's more than just the qualitative stuff.
Awesome. So also related here are like the theses of qualitativism and, well, not, I guess not theses, the thesis of qualitativism, and as you use it in your article, as well as the notion of supervenience. So if you could just sort of connect these two and connect them to the hexaetism, anti-hexaetism dichotomy, that would be helpful.
So hexaetism, anti-hexaetism that's a debate about modality. Like, are there two worlds that are qualitatively the same, yes or no? Qualitativism is a claim about what's fundamental. So the qualitativist will say all of the fundamental facts are qualitative facts. And the non-qualitativist will deny that. They'll say that some fundamental facts involve particular individuals. So for example, the non-qualitativists will say that here's a fundamental fact. This particular electron has this particular mass and is going in this particular trajectory. And the qualitativists will say, no, that's not a fundamental fact because that involves a particular object. And if you think that it's standard to think that the fundamental facts necessitate all the facts. So the non-fundamental facts will supervene on the fundamental facts, where that just means fix the fundamental facts, the non-fundamental facts automatically come for free. And if you think that qualitativism is a necessary truth, then that will entail anti-Higgsiteism, because any two worlds have to differ on their fundamental facts. But if the only fundamental facts there are qualitative facts, then any two worlds have to differ qualitatively. So yeah, so qualitativism is a thesis about what's fundamental, and anti-Higgsiteism is just a thesis about modality.
Awesome. And then supervenience for our audience. So if you could articulate what that is.
Yeah, so we can look at, in the philosophy of mind, there's this debate about whether the mental facts supervene on the physical facts. And that's basically, if you say that they do, then you say that fixing the physical facts, that necessitates all of the mental facts. So any change in the mental facts has to come with the corresponding change in the physical facts. So that's supervenience.
That's good. Yeah, that's good. I have this formula in mind where it's like facts can supervene on other facts, properties can supervene on other properties. Oftentimes it's, supervenience is cast in terms of classes of properties. So like you have one class of properties, the A properties, supervening on another class of properties, the B properties, just in case there can be no change in the A properties without there being a change in the B properties. So that means if you differ worlds or differ situations with respect to their A properties, then there has to be some sort of difference in the B properties. And contrariwise, if you fix all of the B properties, you're going to be fixing all the A properties. So anything which is like a duplicate with respect to the B properties is going to be a duplicate with respect to the A properties. So that's a basic idea.
Yep.
Okay. So now we're moving on to the next section of the video, which is on laws of nature. And so this is where you kind of set up the problem, as it were, the problem cases of resets and things like that. So I guess the first question I want to ask, and I was sort of, you might have been able to tell sort of following the PowerPoint presentation that you sent me. So that was really helpful. How strong are the laws of nature? That's sort of the first question that you ask in your PowerPoint presentation. And this is where you get into like future resets and swaps. So I'll turn it over to you.
Great. So yeah, let's stick with physical theories that purport to be deterministic. Lots of theories purport to be deterministic, like Newton's laws or Maxwell's laws or whatever. So prima facie, it seems like standard definition of determinism is something like, given the laws and the history of the universe up to now, there's only one way that things could go. And so that's what it takes for laws to be deterministic. And there's a worry about whether determinism is actually satisfied by any theory we've ever had. So like physicists will tell you all the time that certain laws are deterministic, but there's certain kinds of like philosophical kind of weirdnesses that might spell trouble for determinism as it's usually spelled out. And the worry is basically that, look, when you do science, really all you care about is the qualitative stuff in the future. So, and it is true that all the theories that people think of as deterministic, given the history of the universe and the laws, there's only one qualitative possibility for how the future might look like. But the worry is there might be all sorts of non-qualitative contingencies about what might happen in the future, where that basically means there might be all these different possibilities for which particular objects might exist and play which different roles in the future. But if there are all these different non-qualitative possibilities, then strictly speaking, determinism will be false. So that's the basic worry, that there's a worry that what scientists think of deterministic laws, really none of them are, because there are all of these non-qualitative possibilities left open for how the future might evolve. And I want to give a bit of historical context here. So there's actually this ongoing debate in the philosophy of physics about general relativity in this argument called the whole argument. And this whole, everything I've been saying about determinism might be false because there's these non-qualitative future possibilities. That's been extensively discussed in the case of general relativity. But our paper basically tries to generalize that to any physical theory, basically. So the worries that people raise for general relativity really are worries that are completely general and apply to any physical theory. So yeah, let me maybe give an example of how a law might tell you all of the qualitative facts in the future, but that leaves open various non-qualitative hypotheses. So again, let's go to like the simplest possible example. Go to a Newtonian world with a single particle just moving in a straight line. So the laws will tell you what will qualitatively happen in the future. Like at every time, there's going to be some particle or other that has this particular position and mass and this velocity, whatever. But there's lots of alternative hypotheses we can give about the non-qualitative future. So here is one. So I call it, and there's different ones depending on which model of persistence you have. So let's start with endurance. So the sort of normal world is just as a single particle that always endures through time, going in a straight line. That's the sort of normal, boring world. But here's another possibility that is consistent with all of the qualitative facts about the future. Namely, there's a single particle that keeps on going in a straight line, but then there's going to come a point, namely future Tuesday, where the particle pops out of existence and a numerically distinct particle pops into existence exactly where the other one would have been, and then keeps on going in a straight line and has the same mass, et cetera, et cetera. So note that no scientist would ever discover the difference between these possibilities, because there's no like empirical test or measurement you can do to tell the difference between these two possibilities. But nonetheless, they seem to be different possibilities. On one, it's the same particle enduring. The other one, it's false. It's not the same particle. It popped out of existence and popped into existence. And if these two are genuinely compatible with Newton's laws, then determinism is false, because take the world up to now, there's two different things that might happen. It might be that the very same particle keeps on going forever, or it might be that next Tuesday it pops out of existence and a new one pops into existence looking exactly like the previous one, and it keeps on going. So that would be a violation of determinism. So the claim is that if Newton's laws only tell you the qualitative stuff, then Newton's laws are actually not deterministic, because it leaves open these two metaphysical possibilities that are consistent with those qualitative laws. And so everything that scientists have ever told you is false. No laws have ever been deterministic. And similar kinds of weirdnesses can happen on perdurance. So a sort of perdurance view would be that there isn't a single particle going in a straight line forever. Rather, there's all these infinitely many, or maybe discretely many, if time is discrete. There's all these slices, and they go in a straight line, and they have the same mass, et cetera, et cetera. Now, so consider one such possibility where there's all these slices. And now let's conjure up a new possibility that violates determinism. Namely, take the first possibility and just swap the positions of two of the slices. So take the future Tuesday slice and the future Wednesday slice, swap their positions. So consider a world where the future Wednesday slice actually came before the future Tuesday slice, and the future Tuesday slice came afterwards. That would be a world that looks qualitatively exactly like the first world. So no like empirical measurement or anything could tell the difference between them. Nonetheless, there are distinct possibilities. The order of the particles is different. On one, future Tuesday came before, and the other one, it came after. And it seems like, again, if Newton's laws just tell you the qualitative future, then they'll leave open all of these possibilities for what might happen next week. In what order will these new particles come into existence? Why that order rather than some other order? There's much more sort of potential sort of chaos in the world than we might have thought. So the world will things will look normal, but there's all these extra facts about which particular objects are playing which particular roles. Like, is it the same thing enduring? Is it a different thing? Did things swap places, etc.? And so, yeah, so the worry is that if the laws of physics only tell you the qualitative facts about the future, then strictly speaking, determinism is false. If we think of determinism as there's only one possible way the future can go, given the past and the laws. And so now there's like a choice point here. You can think one way to respond to this is say, look, actually, I don't care about determinism after all. You know, you caught me. I said that there's only one future. Really, I should have said there's only one qualitative future. Actually, there's tons of things that might happen in the future, but all I'm committed to is there's only one qualitative future. So that's one thing to do, just say, I don't care about determinism. And another option is to say, no, we want determinism to be true. And so we have to somehow get rid of all of these extra weird possibilities of like particles popping in and out of existence and things swapping and stuff like that. So once you realize these potential possibilities for how the future might go, there's that choice point. Do you want to try to get rid of all these possibilities, or are you fine with those possibilities?
Absolutely, that's good. So briefly, just for the audience, I think we're just going to focus on deterministic laws and deterministic worlds for the sake of simplicity. But in your paper, you explicitly extend your discussion to stochastic laws, and you make a similar distinction as you just did within stochastic laws. So you just made a distinction between what we could call, and what you call in your paper, full determinism, or a fully deterministic world, and a merely qualitatively deterministic world, or merely qualitatively deterministic laws. And you could do the same with stochasticity. So the people in the audience who don't like fully deterministic worlds and so on, just read the paper, but also listen to the discussion, because what we say can apply with requisite modifications to stochastic laws. Okay. Now, because we're probably going to use these terms later, I just want to emphasize them for the audience: the full determinism and full lawfulness versus qualitative determinism versus qualitative lawfulness. And the basic idea is one that you were just articulating, right? The qualitative one is basically like qualitative lawfulness, and qualitative determinism is saying that, that's just the thesis that given the past and the laws of nature, given the qualitative past and the laws of nature, there's only one possible qualitative future, and you're not taking a stance on whether or not there's only one possible future simpliciter, because that could involve non-qualitative facts about which particular individuals there are and whether or not swaps occur, etc. Versus full determinism, full lawfulness, that is saying that given the past and laws of nature, there is only one possible future. Not just one possible qualitative future, but one possible future. Those swaps cannot occur. Like, they're not like multiple possibilities, etc. So that's a distinction between full lawfulness and qualitative lawfulness. The full lawfulness is that the past and laws of nature specify all not specify, but determine all the facts about the future. Whereas the qualitative one is that they only determine the qualitative facts about the future. Is that about right?
Perfect. That is all perfect. Yeah.
Okay, sweet. And you did give some reasons there for thinking that our world is fully lawful rather than merely qualitatively lawful. Did you want to say a little bit more about that, or because that does kind of play a role in your paper? So
yeah. So there is this choice point. One is just like, let's just dump full determinism and just go with qualitative determinism. Me and my co-author Trevor don't really like that. So, and we don't really have any knockdown argument against qualitative determinism, but we think that at least if we can secure full determinism, then without too much cost, then I think that would be a good thing to do. And the intuition is just that, we think of, like, take Newton's laws or whatever. I mean, suppose that was like the final physics. We think of the world like evolving in this very natural, nice way. But if only qualitative determinism is true, then the world might be like way more chaotic than we thought. It might be all these random poppings in and out of existence that are totally inexplicable and random. And insofar as you don't want like a totally random, chaotic, crazy and there's like no account of when these things happen or why these things happen, that just like adds a lot of complexity to the world and a lot of irregularity and chaos. And I think also we think that if you like a sort of non-Humean view of laws, where laws sort of like tell the world how to evolve, then we think having full laws is sort of even more something you should want, because sort of the whole project of the non-Humean vision is to like try to explain why the future evolves the way it does in terms of the past. But there's all these totally inexplicable things that happen if merely qualitative laws are true. And there's no rhyme or reason why these things happen. So intuitively, like, the world like wouldn't know what to do. Like, the world would know, like, there have to be some objects that look something like this, but the world wouldn't know, like, is it the same objects or is it different objects, or which different objects? So yeah, those are two reasons. And in the paper, we discussed this other more technical reason about truth making and the A theory and stuff, but I think that's probably sufficient for now.
all right, so that's the first part on laws of nature in the background on full lawfulness versus qualitative lawfulness. And again, going forward, we're probably just going to talk about deterministic laws. So when we say full determinism, think of it in terms of full lawfulness. When we say full lawfulness, think of it in terms of full determinism, etc. Versus, of course, qualitative lawfulness and qualitative determinism. Okay, but now we're moving on to persistence. And so your general strategy in this second part of the paper is to focus on monism, and for the audience, we'll define what that is. And then you switch gears later to pluralism, and then you apply this to both endurantism and perdurantism, and connecting this to full lawfulness, etc. Okay, so basically, can you just talk about your general strategy here so that we situate the audience?
Yeah. Okay. So our ultimate goal is like, we want to secure full lawfulness. And we want to explore how we might try to secure that given endurantism and given perdurantism. And it turns out like we want to start with the absolute simplest setting. And the absolute simplest setting is where only one object exists at a time. And it turns out that a lot of the philosophical complexities already arise just when there's only one object. And then we can get some more maybe realistic views where there's like multiple particles and stuff. But for the moment, I just want to assume that like monism is true, where monism is just there's only one thing that exists at a time. So, and people, have defended that for other reasons of like quantum mechanics or stuff. But let's suppose that, there's only like the universe at a time. And we're going to see, turns out all of these problems with full determinism arise. And we just want to sort of try to solve the case for monism first in the paper, just because that's the simplest setting. And then it turns out that we generalize that to the case where there's lots of objects like particles or space-time points or whatever, and lots of the same dialectic will arise. So basically I want to start with, let's work with endurantism and monism. Let's see what happens, how we can try to get full lawfulness. And then let's switch gears to perdurantism and monism, see what happens, how we can get full lawfulness. And then after we do all that, we'll say some things about how this extends to the non-monistic case. And it turns out a lot of things will be similar. So basically we do the just focus on monism for simplicity's sake.
Awesome. Yeah. So we're going to break this up into 3 parts, as you just kind of mentioned. We're assuming monism at the start, and then we look at endurantist monism and then perdurantist monism. And we're seeing how they can secure full lawfulness, because that's the ultimate goal. And then we switch to pluralism. We get rid of that monism thing, and then we look at endurantism and perdurantism within those at the same time. So that's why there are 3. Okay, so moving on to monism, of course, in the background, but now we are going to endurantism. So we're on the monism, and then we're going on to the endurantist part of that, and then we will switch to the perdurantist part of that, and we'll see what happens. How are we going to get to secure full lawfulness? Okay, so onto endurantist monism and ontological inertia. So this is where the existential inertia stuff comes in. So we have this problem, which is the future Tuesday reset problem that you kind of articulated earlier. And you go through a kind of proposed solution to the problem, which you call in the paper ontological inertia. So can you tell us about ontological inertia? And then for my audience, I mean, I could probably compare and contrast ontological inertia with existential inertia. So
yeah, okay, so let's work with endurantism and monism. So let's suppose there's only one object and like it evolves according to Schrodinger's equation or whatever it is. And why might there be threats to full lawfulness? Well, there might be this future Tuesday reset problem where the world endures and the next Tuesday it randomly pops out of existence, and a world that looks just like it pops into existence and keeps on going as if the previous thing were there. And what we want is some kind of principle that rules this out. And if we were to rule out these poppings in and out, then we would be done, because if we could have the sort of normal possibility where it's the same universe that's always enduring through time, just as time goes on, then there would be no problem. We'd get full lawfulness, because which object will exist in the future? The one that's always existed in the past. So the basic goal is to try to rule out this kind of weird popping in and out. And the sort of obvious thing to try to think of is some principle to the effect of, if the universe has always been around, it's going to keep on being around so long as there's any universe. So we need some kind of principle that the universe will keep going. And in the paper, we label that as ontological inertia, that the thing that exists in the past will keep on existing. And yeah, there's lots of, you could distinguish between sort of metaphysically necessary versions of ontological inertia, where it's metaphysically necessary that the world has to keep on going. Or to get what we want, we could just restrict it to nomologically necessary ontological inertia. Then that would also give us full lawfulness. And so in the paper, we sort of distinguish, let's start with looking at metaphysically necessary versions. That would get us what we want. So in one sense, we're done, because that gets us what we want. But there's this extra follow-up question, like, is there any sort of deeper story as to why that is? Is there any kind of independent motivation, or is the only motivation to get this end result? So we look at metaphysically necessary ontological inertia, what might some independent motivations be, and then we go to nomologically necessary ontological inertia and see how that might fare. So that's the sort of outline for what we do in this section.
Awesome. Yeah, and then, as should be clear for my audience, it's very similar to the existential inertia thesis as I kind of articulate it. So in the book, I think I should be able to point the right direction. Yes, I pointed the right direction. So in the book there, we articulate existential inertia as the thesis that at least some temporal concrete object or objects, so some subset thereof, persist in existence in the absence of something outside of them that kind of continually gives them existence, as well as in the absence of factors that destroy the object. So it's sort of similar to like Newtonian inertia, right? They don't have some sort of continual impetus propelling like objects throughout space or whatever. They just continue in their rectilinear velocity or whatever. And also, I mean, they're going to change their velocity if something exerts some kind of force on them. And that's similar to like the destructive force. And so I just wanted to point out to the audience that they're pretty similar. But going forward, I mean, we could just let's just call your thesis ontological inertia. I don't know if you wanted to say anything about that.
I think that's basically totally right. I mean, it just the thesis we're looking at is a bit more specific in the sense that it's really tailored to endurantism specifically.
Yeah.
You could formulate existential inertia and perdurantism, but it actually just wouldn't help with the debate we're looking at because there's still the swap problem and stuff. So yeah, we're looking at specifically the endurantist version, but obviously, yeah, they're very similar. And as we'll go on, that a lot of the things you say in support of existential inertia also can be said in support of ontological inertia. Yeah.
Awesome. And so then you said, you have this question of sort of motivating this ontological inertia thesis, and like, are we just kind of deploying it here to secure full lawfulness, or is there some sort of independent motivation for it? Now, for the audience, we're going to be asking, like, why does ontological inertia hold? And that is potentially ambiguous. So just for the audience, I want them to be aware of this distinction. So when we ask, why does ontological inertia hold? We could be asking, on the one hand, what explains why something persists in the manner specified by the ontological inertia thesis? Or we could be asking, like, why believe that things persist in the manner specified by the ontological inertia thesis? One of them is about like some sort of like metaphysical explanation or metaphysical account of ontological inertia, like things persist in this manner. Why is that the case? Why do they do that? What explains that? What metaphysically explains that? The other one is about like, what is our reason for believing something? Now, these two sometimes can be very similar. You might have a reason for believing something that coincides with or underwrites some sort of metaphysical explanation, and similarly you might have a metaphysical explanation that underwrites a reason for believing it, but they are distinct for the audience, and I just think it's helpful to give people these sorts of conceptual tools for their toolkit to be able to disentangle these closely related things. So yeah, did you want to say any more about that, and like which one you're focusing on, and then we'll go into the potential explanations of why things persist in the manner specified by the ontological inertia thesis.
I guess in our paper, I totally agree with the distinction. In our paper, I guess we didn't sharply distinguish it. We were just sort of more neutrally saying, like, is there any independent motivation for it? And that independent motivation can be a reason to believe it or a reason to see why it's true. Obviously, the better thing is why it's true, because if you know why it's true, that both gives you a reason to believe it and it tells you why it's true. So that'd be the better thing. I think most of the options we'll look at are attempts at explaining why it's true, not just merely believing it's true. But yeah, there's definitely that distinction. I mean, just to illustrate the distinction, like if you're told like by testimony that a certain like mathematical conjecture is true, that's like, oh, that's a reason to believe it. But obviously it's the reason why the mathematical facts are as they are isn't because this person told you anything. So so yeah, I think that's definitely.
Okay, sweet. So then in your paper, you go through 4 potential explanations of why things, and in this case, again, for the audience, we are assuming monism, right? So the thing in question is the universe at a time. That's like the object that we're focusing on. Again, it's a simplifying assumption, and they go on to apply it in their paper to pluralism as well. But we are focusing here on monism, which is just that, there's just one thing in reality. And in this case, again, it's the universe at a time. So we're looking at 4 potential explanations of why the universe at a time persists in the manner specified by the ontological inertia thesis. So the 4 are basically, firstly, you look at an appeal to essences or natures to explain it. Secondly, you look at an appeal to what you call temporal rationalism to explain it, which is basically the idea that, hey, these future swaps that you're talking about, these sort of non-qualitative aberrancies, they involve certain like inexplicabilities. So like, it'd just be inexplicable if like a particle popped into existence and then the next one popped into existence exactly like it and persisted exactly in accord. And you need some sort of explanatory principle saying like, hey, that's not possible. You can't have those sort of inexplicabilities. So that's the second one. The third one you look at is basically combining non-Humean laws and Hume's dictum, which I thought was very interesting, and we'll get some interaction there because I sort of disagreed with that one. But and then the fourth one was appealing to strong laws. Okay, so that's the four, and we will just proceed through each of these in turn for the audience. Okay, first one is essences or natures. So can you take us through this one? And I mean, you can honestly also take us through your verdict on it after you explain it.
Yeah, sure. So great. So there's this prima facie conceivability argument against a metaphysically necessary version of ontological inertia. So take the thesis that it's metaphysically necessary that if the universe exists now, it'll keep on existing so long as there's some universe around. Prima facie conceivability argument against that. Look, we can conceive of the world popping in and out like future Tuesday reset. So what do you say to that? And like in the philosophy literature, perhaps the most popular way to sort of respond to conceivability arguments is by appeal to essences or the natures of things. So here, like the canonical case is like we can conceive of water not being H2O, but philosophical orthodoxy says that water is essentially H2O. And so even though it's conceivable, it's not possible because that's just what water is. And water can't be different than what it actually is. So yeah, appeals to essences are popular ways to respond to conceivability arguments. And so on this kind of view, it would be something like, it's essential to the universe that if there's some universe around tomorrow, then it will be that one, something like that. We don't like this terribly much. And there's, I mean, for every single one of these, there's like so much to say.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I mean, one thing to say is just, I mean, the ideology of like essences and natures that then, you know, some philosophers don't like essence talk. I myself, in some moods, don't like essences. So you might just be skeptical of essences across the board. But another reason to be skeptical is, especially if we deal with, if what we're trying to secure is the metaphysical necessity of ontological inertia, it doesn't just suffice to say it's essential to this universe that if there's going to be a universe tomorrow, it will be it, or where the two its are subscripted. You have to say that not only is that an essential feature of this universe, it's an essential feature of any possible universe. So every possible universe has this essence. And, you know, maybe I could be comfortable with this universe has that essence, although I would not be terribly comfortable with that on its own. But to say that it's impossible for a universe to lack that essence, I think I would want some kind of independent reason for. Because if you don't have an independent reason for it, it just seems like you're sort of just coming up with a theory about essences. You're just sort of like starting with your modal conclusions and like trying to reverse engineer some view of essence to get it. But the view of essence just sort of comes out of nowhere. And the only reason to accept the view of essence is to accept the view of modality. But if it's true, like if it's true that the only reason to accept the view about essences is to get the view about modality, then we really haven't made progress. We've just sort of reverse engineered a view to get it. So yeah, you might just be skeptical of essences in general. And to get the necessary version, you have to think all possible universes have to have these essences. And that seems like a very strong claim.
One thing I liked about your paper at this point was that you pointed out how there's a relevant dissimilarity between like the conceivability case with respect to like water and other essentialist claims and this case. And that relevant dissimilarity is that in the case of water, like what we are conceiving, okay, fine. We're not conceiving water being XYZ instead of H2O, but we are conceiving of something like water, and that is surely possible, like which has like something like a qualitative profile of water where it's liquid of sorts, it's clear, it falls from the skies, it's in oceans and rivers and things like that, but it's XYZ. Okay, it's not water, but it's still water, and that's presumably possible. Like we have every reason to believe that that's possible, or at least so the non-mitigated modal skeptics would want us to think. I'm not sure if that's possible, but but setting that aside, so like yeah, I mean that's a relevant difference because in the case of ontological inertia, what we are conceiving is actually not like a possibility according to them. Like you just pointed out, like the metaphysical necessity version of ontological inertia thesis, like there actually isn't a possible universe at a time which behaves in this chaotic way. they have to say every single possible world is essentially like this. So there's a relevant dissimilarity there, and that's arguably a cost. So yeah, I like that part of the paper. Did you want to comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, I basically totally agree. Yeah. In the water case, there's a sort of error theory, like we are conceiving of a picture of the world that really is possible. We're just sort of misdescribing it. It's not water, it's water or something. But in this kind of case, we have this picture of the world of things popping in and out, and there just is no redescription of that or anything. It's just like flat out false. So it's just disanalogous to the water case. And, you know, lots of people think there are metaphysical necessities that are disanalogous to the water case, but this just shows that it's like an additional commitment to think that there are such necessities. Yeah.
Yeah, so I have two more points on this before we go to like the temporal rationalism one, the second potential explanation. So, well, I guess, I mean, I had 3 points here, but the first one we can just skip. The second one was like, I don't know if this is a good response. I just wanted to hear what you think about it because I think it's interesting. So I'm wondering if like the proponent of the metaphysically necessary ontological inertia thesis, who accepts this kind of essentialist account of it, I'm wondering if they'd be able to say, well, okay, you're appealing to conceivability to argue against my case. I can appeal to conceivability too. I can at least conceive that my metaphysically necessary essential ontological inertia thesis is true. And given S5 modal logic, right, if the thesis is possibly true, then it must in fact be true because it'd be possibly necessarily true. And you could just shave off that possibility operator. And so if conceivability defeasibly supports possibility, well, then perhaps the conceivability of the truth of this metaphysically necessary existential inertia thesis would actually count in favor of the thesis. And so maybe these appeals to conceivability kind of cancel one another out. I guess that's the idea. So I wonder what you think about this.
Yeah, so that's a very good point. And it's a point that, so just like a literature point. So David Chalmers, this philosopher at NYU, has probably done the most to sort of defend this view that conceivability entails possibility. And he has this really big paper, which is one of my favorite papers, I think, of all time, maybe, it's just called Does Conceivability Entail Possibility? And if people are interested in this question, he has this explicit discussion on exactly this question. Because because there's a sort of, there's a way to develop your argument that just shows that the thesis that conceivability entails possibility just implies a contradiction because it implies that, take the case of God. So it seems conceivable that God necessarily exists. And it seems conceivable that he doesn't exist. But given S5, et cetera, those just contradict each other. So it's just contradictory to think that conceivability entails possibility. And there's like a number of things to do here. One sort of move that maybe is a bit ad hoc, you can just say, restrict the conceivability entails possibility to non-modal claims. You can just do that, and that'll get off this problem, but you might think that's a bit ad hoc. I think the better move is to try to argue against it's conceivably necessary. Like take the God example. That question: is it conceivable that there's a necessary being? And I think the best strategy for proponents of conceivability entails possibilities is to say that maybe that's like prima facie conceivable, but it's actually not conceivable. And the thought is if you like equate conceivability and possibility, then conceiving of a necessary being is basically like conceiving that it's not conceivable that God doesn't exist or something. And you might think it's inconceivable to conceive that God, or like there's too many conceivables to have this, but it's not conceivable that God conceivably doesn't exist or something. That it's just sort of an a priori truth that it's conceivable that God doesn't exist, and so it's not conceivable that God exists in all possible worlds, because that's the same as saying it's not conceivable that God exists in all conceivable worlds or something. Anyway, so I think the best strategy is to try to argue against the view that it's conceivable that God necessarily exists, and in this dialectical context to say that it's not conceivable that ontological inertia is necessarily true. But yeah, people should read that paper if they want more on this.
Yeah, and I won't dwell on that because we need to move on further, but there's a lot to say back and forth on that one. That's super fun. But okay, and the final one is just like a dialectical point for my audience. So this is not really necessarily targeting your paper, but it is targeting like the existential inertia debate at large, because I kind of want to connect that to what my audience is interested in. And so importantly, detractors of the existential inertia thesis, they actually typically endorse a symmetrical thesis to like necessary ontological inertia, as you kind of put it, and it's necessary ontological expiration, we might call it. And on this sort of thesis, it's necessarily the case that every temporal concrete object at any time does not exist at later times, unless it's like propelled forward, as it were, by an outside conserving cause. And so what I just want to say is that a lot of the objections in your paper to this account of the necessary ontological inertia thesis would equally be applying to the necessary ontological expiration thesis. So for instance, if necessary ontological inertia is puzzling or problematic, if it's puzzling how things could have this ontological inertia tendency essentially and in every possible world, it's equally going to be puzzling how they have this ontological expiration tendency in every possible world essentially. So that's one point that I just wanted to make. Like, I don't want the detractors of existential inertia to just latch onto your paper and be like, aha, this account of existential inertia fails. It's like, well, actually, you guys are in the same boat. So that's one thing I want to say. And then the second thing that I want to say that's relevant to the existential inertia debate is that we can still have good reason to think that the actual things essentially enjoy this guarantor of continued existence, even if we don't have good reason to think that it's like necessarily the case in every possible world that things essentially enjoy this guarantor. Yeah, so I just wanted to say those two things. Did you have any comments on those?
Yeah, totally agree with the first thing. This isn't an argument for necessary. None of the things we're saying here are in any way motivate necessary ontological expiration. The second point, you have to be a bit careful about, because so one claim is that the actual world has this essence, but that on its own won't get you what we want. So we want full lawfulness, and to get full lawfulness, we have to think it's nomonologically necessary that if the world has to continue. And you might think it's nomonologically possible if there's a different universe than this one that the laws operate on. So like maybe there's, there could be a world with totally different initial conditions, and that'll be a totally different universe. And full lawfulness says that one also can't have these weird poppings in and out. So you'd have to say not only does the actual world have this essence, but all nomonologically possible worlds have this essence. There's a question, exactly how strong that is and how does it relate to the metaphysical possibility thing. But yeah, just wanted to flag that.
That's good. Okay, so that is the first account of, I'm calling them accounts of ontological inertia. So basically explanations of why ontological inertia holds. Now we're moving on to the second account, which is temporal rationalism. So this is the idea, or the idea behind this is explaining the necessity of ontological inertia. So we're still working with necessary ontological inertia thesis, explaining that through, firstly, the fact that resets that you talked about involve like inexplicable changes, like something just like inexplicably popping into existence or going out of existence, together with, secondly, the fact that such inexplicable changes are impossible. And maybe you appeal to some sort of rationalist principle of sufficient reason or something like that, which says that, hey, these inexplicable changes are metaphysically impossible. So that's a basic idea. If you want to say anything more about that, and you can take us through your verdict as well on this sort of account.
Great. Yeah, so you basically said what I wanted to say. So yeah, there's a question of like what exactly is inexplicable about temporal rationalism. So about violations of ontological inertia. So the basic strategy is violations of ontological inertia would be inexplicable. Things can't be inexplicable, therefore ontological inertia. That's the view. And so there's like two steps. One is violations would be inexplicable. Second, that there can't be inexplicable stuff going on. The first step is like, okay, what exactly is inexplicable? Like take the future Tuesday reset. So one thing that's inexplicable is like why next Tuesday rather than next Wednesday or like next Monday? That seems like totally random. And also when it goes out and when something pops out and pops in, why did the particular thing pop in rather than some other possible thing? So when particle A, pops out and particle B pops in, why did that particular particle B pop in rather than particle C or particle D or something? So it seems like there's multiple different like inexplicable things that happen in like future Tuesday reset. And I think the first part is pretty well supported that cases like future Tuesday reset would be inexplicable. And then there's this question, of things can't be inexplicable. And obviously, in terms of our verdict, I like the first step of the argument that violations would be inexplicable. But the claim that it's impossible for the world to change in inexplicable ways, that's a very strong principle, and we don't really motivate it much in the paper because that takes us way too far afield. Obviously there are like whole books on the principle of sufficient reason and all these arguments, and basically if you like the principle of sufficient reason, you'll of course like step 2. So I think if you have antecedent sympathies to something like the principle of sufficient reason, then you might like this. It's also worth noting that, I mean, this is like way weaker than the principle of sufficient reason. There's lots of objections that apply to the principle of sufficient reason that don't apply here. So some people have claimed that principle of sufficient reason results in like modal collapse, that there's only one possible world and everything's necessary. This kind of principle does not. So merely saying that changes in the world can't be totally inexplicable, it's consistent with that, like that the initial conditions are totally brute and inexplicable. The laws of nature might be totally brute and inexplicable. So you can still have lots of brute and inexplicable stuff according to like what we call temporal rationalism. So it's just like a much weaker version of the PSR, and it avoids a lot of the criticisms to the PSR. So we think it's much more defensible, but it's still like a really big claim that a lot of philosophers would disagree with. So like the ultimate verdict is that it's, basically how promising it is going to depend on your background views, but we think it's more promising than the essentialist strategy, at least.
Yeah, mileage may vary, basically. I'm wondering if there are ways to push back on that first part of it, so that like these sorts of changes would indeed be inexplicable. So I was wondering, like, maybe the world at a time has a disposition to annihilate or to cease to exist, and in doing so to causally bring about a particular numerically distinct world at a time, when it's not sustained in existence. And maybe the sustaining cause is ceasing its sustaining activity next Tuesday. Now, of course, you can explain like you can ask what explains these further facts, like why does it have this disposition, or what explains why the sustaining cause ceased its operation in that way. I don't know, maybe like there's some sort of like objectively chancy timeless thing, like this timeless thing which like sustains temporal things in existence, and there are some objective chances, and it just so happens that the objective chances went this way, and objective chances those have explanations in terms of I don't know, the nature of the thing in question, or maybe like God decided because he just wanted to pull a prank or something. I honestly, I mean, my point is just that like it seems as though there could be explanations of like these sorts of resets, like if things have dispositions to annihilate when they're not sustained, and they also have like dispositions to bring about things at the next moment. So I'm wondering what you think about that.
I mean, I basically agree with that. I mean, I totally agree that, so monism is doing some work here. So like, if you think there's really only one thing, there can't be some external thing that like, because obviously like, I mean, like things go out of existence all the time, like, because you blow things up and stuff or whatever. But usually we explain why things go out of existence by appeal to like some other thing, like blowing something up or something. But in the case, if we really think that there's only one thing and there's like no God and no extra stuff, then that can't explain it. But there is this other thing that you mentioned of like that there's like this internal disposition for the universe to cease to exist on Tuesday. And there's a question, so I guess you could just say there's, the disposition is inherently linked to Tuesday somehow, that's unclear how it works. But another one is, just like, there's a chancy thing that it expires at any moment, and it happened to be Tuesday. And then that gets into thorny questions of like chance and explanation. Is it like, what you could still have like this contrastive question of like why that time rather than some other time and things like that. But I basically think that those are, I mean, I really don't, the one thing that I really don't see is like how it could, like suppose universe A popped out and universe B popped in. I don't see how it could make, like, why universe B rather than universe C. It's really hard to see how there could be a disposition, because B like doesn't even exist yet. So like the disposition would have to somehow like grab like some hexaid that's not even actual, and like think only that one has to exist, and it's really unclear how that could be. But I think these are definitely things worth exploring.
Awesome. Well, for purposes of time, let's move on to the third account of ontological inertia, and this is the fun one: the non-Humean laws plus Hume's dictum. I haven't seen other people conjoin those together. Usually, I see people who like Humean's laws and they're just crapping on Hume's dictum, which I'm like, yeah, go you. So anyway, like basically, the strategy here is to explain the necessity of ontological inertia through those two things. So basically, could you take us through the strategy and through your verdict?
Great. So this strategy gives up on the claim that ontological inertia is just necessary, period. So we don't try to get that. What we try to get is a conditional thing that if non-Humeanism is true, then ontological inertia has to be true. So that's the view we're trying to defend. So why should you like that view? And here there's this sort of totally independent dialectic that we sort of wheeled in as a way to sort of independently motivate the view. So within like the wars between Humeans and non-Humeans, I mean, before we were talking about like, how do we even distinguish Humeans and non-Humeans? And one was like this primitive necessity. Another way to distinguish the Humean and non-Humean views was this Humean views satisfy Hume's dictum and non-Humean views don't satisfy Hume's dictum. And then Humeans say that, look, one of the reasons why we don't like non-Humean views is because they reject Hume's dictum. So Humeans often use Hume's dictum as an objection to non-Humean views. And the strategy here is actually, look, non-Humeans can avoid this central objection that has always plagued them if they have this view. So you sort of kill two birds with one stone, you sort of reply to this objection at the same time, get full lawfulness. So that was the strategy, sort of kill two birds with one stone within this dialectic. So let me say more about the dialectic. So okay, so what is Hume's dictum? We haven't even said it. So Hume's dictum is the view that there can't be necessary connections between wholly distinct entities. So what does wholly distinct mean? So at a minimum, it means distinct. So two entities can only be wholly distinct if they're distinct, but also they can't have any mereological or spatiotemporal overlap. So obviously there can be necessary connections between two things that are not distinct, like trivial ones, like if I'm 6 foot tall, that necessitates that I'm 6 foot tall. So obviously even Humeans will think they're necessary connections between the same thing. And they might think that there are like not so trivial necessary connections between the same thing. So you might think if a particle has 7 units of mass, that entails that it can't have 9 units of mass. So that's like not so trivial. Another like not so trivial one is like if a particular object has a certain shape, then it has to have a certain color. That might be another kind of necessary connection between, but it's not between wholly distinct things, it's between the very same thing. So there might be all these necessary connections between the same thing of like shape and color and determinants and stuff. And there's also necessary connections between things that overlap. So, if there's an apple and I put a bunch of paint on that apple, that'll necessitate that half the apple changes also. Like if the whole apple becomes blue, then the half of the apple will become blue. And that's a very, not very problematic necessary connection. So basically, the necessary connections that Humeans don't like are the ones between wholly distinct entities. And so the thought is, I think, do we use this? Anyway, so consider this example of like two light bulbs. They're like wholly distinct light bulbs. And suppose a metaphysician comes along and says, it's absolutely necessary that the first light is on if and only if the second light is on. So they can't be out of sync. It's just absolutely metaphysically impossible if they're out of sync. And the Humean is like, what? Why? Like, how does the first light even know about the second light? Like, how does this transmit the information? It's, it seems conceivable the first light's on with the second light. That seems like a very weird necessary connection. And it seems weird in part because they're wholly distinct lights. Like, yeah, how does the one light even know about the second light? So Humeans don't like this. So they formulated this principle of no necessary connections between wholly distinct entities. And let's look at this future Tuesday reset world. So we're assuming that non-Humanism is true, and we're assuming that this future Tuesday reset world. If we make those two assumptions, then we violate Hume's dictum, because there would be necessary connections between the prior universe, let's say universe A pops out of existence, and universe B pops in and behaves in certain ways. According to the non-Humean, there are necessary connections between the state of the universe, universe A, and the state of the universe B, even though they're wholly distinct entities. They're A distinct, and they don't have any mereological or spatiotemporal overlap. So the future Tuesday reset world would be one that violates Hume's dictum. If non-Humanism is true, there'd be necessary connection between the wholly distinct universe A and the universe B. But interesting thing to note that if it's the exact same universe, there's just a universe A enduring, then there are no necessary connections between wholly distinct entities. For one, there are no wholly distinct entities. The only entity in the world is A. A is not wholly distinct from itself because it's numerically identical to itself. And so there's no necessary connections between distinct existences. So this is like kind of a weird thing because all other non-Humean views violate Hume's dictum with primitive laws or these causal powers and whatnot. So like every other non-Humean view pretty much ever formulated violates Hume's dictum. But here's a non-Humean view that satisfies Hume's dictum. And so insofar as Hume's dictum is one of the main motivations for being a Humean and one of the main objections to non-Humanism, it turns out you can get rid of that objection and satisfy this. So So yeah, basically the intuition is that the only intelligible way for there to be necessary connections between two things is if they're not wholly distinct. And so that's motivation for thinking if non-humanism is true, the only way those necessary connections can be intelligible is if the one universe keeps on enduring and there isn't this weird popping in and popping out. Yeah.
Awesome. So I guess my main reservation for this was like Hume and typical proponents of Hume's dictum wouldn't be a fan of, or at least I don't think they would be fans of any non-Humean laws that engender necessary connections, even within a single enduring object across time. And that's because a single enduring object at one time is numerically, I'm going to restart that. This is because while an enduring object at one time is numerically identical with the same object at another time, right, as you point out, they're still spatiotemporally non-overlapping, it seems, and the motivations behind Hume's dictum support, I would argue, there being no necessary connections among any spatiotemporally non-overlapping existences, even if it's the same existence, so to speak. I mean, after all, Hume would decidedly reject, I think, that, say, it's ever necessary that an object persists from one time to another. The object, for Hume, could just, like, randomly pop out of existence or explode or turn into a butterfly or do any number of conceivable things. And so, basically, like, to put my worry, I guess, differently, conditional on x persisting from t to t plus 1, yeah, there will be necessary connections between x at t and itself at t plus 1, because it's the same thing, of course. But like x persisting from t to t plus 1 cannot itself be necessary if we take Hume's dictum seriously, and if we take the motivations behind Hume's dictum seriously. So I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, so I think there's two objections there. One is this actually does violate Hume's dictum because they're spatially non-overlapping. And another worry is even if it does technically satisfy Hume's dictum, there's like the overlying spirit is still violated somehow. And I think for the first objection, I want to just say there is no violation of Hume's dictum strictly interpreted. So when you say take the object at t and the object at t plus 1, they're not spatially overlapping. So the endurantists will say you refer to the exact same thing when you say the object at t and the object at t plus 1. And if you ask which spatial regions does the object at t occupy, they'll say either. I mean, it's weird because on a monist setting, it's unclear whether there is space and this thing occupying space, because that would not be a monistic view. It would be like there's two things, rather that the universe is like space itself, so it doesn't really occupy anything. But anyway, but one natural thing is that, yeah, they occupy the same space, namely all of space or something. And also just like one, I mean, for two things to be wholly distinct, they have to be A, distinct, and B, have nomeological spatiotemporal overlap. So I do want to say it like it has the letter of Hume's dictum, but I totally agree with the second point that the mere fact that these necessary connections are between the same existent, you might still have all these worries of like, okay, but here's another view that doesn't violate Hume's dictum. The universe grows into a butterfly or explodes or whatever, and but all of those are, those are weird things that Humeans would not like. So yeah, why did the world evolve in this particular way rather than those other ways? And that seems conceivable, so that's bad. And I basically totally agree with all of that. So I think what I'd say is something like, there's lots of different Humean worries about non-humanism. And I think Hume's dictum is just one worry among others. And so I think to satisfy the Humean intuitions, a necessary condition is to satisfy Hume's dictum, but it's not a sufficient condition. And all we really need is that it's a necessary condition and that it's one thing, that it satisfies this particular thing. But I totally agree that you need to do more to satisfy the human intuitions. I think there's a lot to be said about that more that you can say. And I don't know whether to launch into that here or just leave it.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Okay. Okay, great.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And honestly, let's just move on to the fourth account, which is strong laws.
Sure.
So this is the one where we're jettisoning the idea that the ontological inertia thesis is metaphysically necessary, and we're saying that it's merely.
Can I say one more thing about
yeah.
So yeah, just because I think this is an important point, but also I'm happy to go a bit longer. You can edit this out also. But anyway, one, take the following case of something popping into existence ex nihilo. So suppose there's absolutely nothing, and then a tiger pops into existence. Intuition, that's really spooky and crazy and weird. And there's lots of different reasons you might think that's spooky and crazy and weird. Here's one intuition that it would make much more sense if there was like some pre-existing material, and the pre-existing material sort of arrange itself into a tiger. So it would make much more sense that there was like a material cause of the tiger, that there's some pre-existing material and you rearrange it to have a tiger. So that's one diagnosis about why the tiger thing is mysterious. You might think there's other reasons to think it's mysterious, like there's no like efficient cause, whatever it is, but that's one reason to think the tiger thing is mysterious. And I think one crucial point that this is the intuition that sort of Sally Haslinger is pushing for this kind of thought, which we discuss in the paper, that if perdurantism is right, or take the Future Tuesday reset case, or let's just take a normal tiger in the jungle that has things that preceded it. So, take the tiger at this time. According to perdurantism, there's an important sense in which the tiger has no material cause, because there's none of the constituents of the tiger were around in the past. So that time slice of the tiger just sort of popped into existence. It wasn't through pre-existing material getting rearranged or whatever it is. And I think that's the intuition that sort of that we talk about in the paper of like that sort of this sort of mysterious kind of thing. But if you're an endurantist, you don't have that. You have like really, there was actually stuff in the past and they were just reformed. And so in the monistic setting, what happens is you just have this pre-existing stuff and it just sort of changes as time goes on. But if you have this Future Tuesday reset thing, it would be sort of like something popping into existence ex nihilo, in the sense that it would pop out of existence, not out of any pre-existing stuff. It would just, things would pop in and pop out. And that's one reason why things might be mysterious. But obviously there might be other reasons why things are mysterious in terms of like, why don't they just become a butterfly or something? But I think that's just one reason why endurance might make sort of causal connections more intelligible than endurance. Anyway.
Awesome. No, that's good. So now we can probably go to the fourth account of ontological inertia. And this one jettisons the idea that the ontological inertia thesis is metaphysically necessary, and it instead holds that it's merely nomically necessary. And of course, it's supplemented with a conception of laws. So do you want to take us through this one and your verdict?
Great. So the main virtue of this is that it's a strictly weaker claim. So it's strictly more plausible because it's just a weaker claim. And in face of the conceivability argument, it just says, yeah, it is possible. So the conceivability argument works, but that's just irrelevant to what I want, because all I want is that it's nomologically necessary. And it gets us what we want. It gets us that the world is fully lawful, not merely qualitatively lawful. So yeah, I think that it checks a lot of boxes and is really good in all of those respects. I think in order to get into the details of whether we accept it at the end of the day, I think it's in the paper we go through different views about laws and how they might be more or less sympathetic to this kind of view. So we go through like the primitivist view about laws and the universals view about laws and the powers view about laws and humanism. And we discussed each of the options in the paper, and none of them are like perfectly great, but yeah, I think like primitivist, like if you're antecedently inclined to primitivism or something, then I think this is a very natural kind of view that you just, so we started the dialectic by saying, look, the laws only tell you about qualitative stuff, but there's all these possibilities for the future about non-qualitative changes. And the response is just to beef up the laws and say, look, it's true that like scientists don't care about these non-qualitative stuff, but like we should just sort of beef up the laws that are in the physics textbooks. They don't tell you just about the qualitative stuff. They tell you about which particular things keep on existing, and namely, they tell you that like the universe keeps on existing. So this would basically just be that, to strengthen the laws. And I think if you're antecedently inclined to something like primitivism or something, then this would be a very natural kind of view. And we also got in the paper, like if you're Humean, is this a natural view? And we think you can have this, but maybe it's like less explanatory than other kind of views, and that gets into a rabbit hole of like, is humanism explanatory and stuff.
Oh yeah. I was gonna talk about that one because that's an interesting one. But no, I think that's good. And for people who want more details, they can definitely check out the paper for that one. So now we can go on to the perdurantist monism one and the problem of swaps. So again, we've been talking about monism. We just looked at the endurantist monist options for securing full lawfulness, and now we're going to move on to the perdurantist monist ones. And then we're going to be really brief with the pluralism section. I'll just let you, once we get to it, I'll let you just gesture towards how our conclusions with respect to the monism can pretty swiftly be generalized to the pluralism, and then we'll just look at the payoffs, and then we will conclude. So not too much longer. But yeah, so on to perdurantist monism. So basically just remind the audience about the problem of swaps, and then talk about how anti-Hexaetism solves the problem and why it leads the perdurantists to accept qualitativism.
Great. So we want the world to be fully lawful, and we're looking at a setting where monism and perdurantism is true. And so here's the problem. So take the actual world, which on this view is a sequence of world slices, world slice A, then world slice B, then world slice C, and they qualitatively obey the laws. And now I ask, look, why aren't there violations of determinism? Because I could imagine a world that is just like this one up to now, but then in the future, there are two world slices that swap their places, for example. And that would be two different ways the world could go. It could go in this way, or it could be that the world slices come in a different order. And so that's a violation of determinism, and that's bad. So what we want to do is try to get rid of that violation of determinism. And let me say one kind of strategy before we launch into anti-Hexaetism. So I think the very natural kind of view is to say something like, look, you can't just do these arbitrary swaps because that would violate the essential properties of certain of these world slices. So you could try to appeal to essences or something to get rid of these swaps. And ultimately, we think this doesn't work because for similar reasons as the first essentialist one. So let's just consider the world with a single particle going in a straight line, and there's all these particle slices. Here's an essentialist view you can have. Every particle slice has all of its intrinsic properties, essentially. That essentialist view won't solve the problem of swaps, because at each time the particle has the exact same mass, the exact same velocity, et cetera. So each of these are intrinsically identical. So you can just swap them and they'd have the same essential properties. You could say, oh, things have their intrinsic properties essentially and their relational properties essentially, their qualitative relational properties. That also wouldn't solve it, because there's just a straight line and everything is sort of symmetric for any particular point. And so you could appeal to even stronger essentialist properties that these particular slices have to come in the exact order that it's essential to them that they come in the exact order. So like it's essential to particle slice A that it comes after particle slice B and before particle slice C or something. And actually that won't get you it either. That'll solve the swap problem, but there'll be other problems like you can sort of stretch out the particle slices and keep their order in a way. So that won't solve it either. And anyway, so we think that if you look at all the plausible views about essences, they don't solve the problem. And the only way to solve the problem is this sort of ridiculously strong views about essences, at which case you're sort of, just making up views about essences to reverse engineer the modal conclusions, it seems. So we think, and notice that none of the other views we looked at work. So temporal rationalism, that's not gonna, the swap worlds look just as explicable as the non-swap worlds. So, and also primitive laws don't seem to help. So that's, I think, an important disanalogy. So for the endurantist case, you can just say the thing that has existed always will exist. But in the perdurantist setting, you have to beef up the laws to say that particle A has to follow particle B, then particle C. You have to have like infinitely many different names for particle slices for every possible slice that exists. And that would make the laws ridiculously complicated in a way that it isn't for endurantism. Because endurantism, you just say, the thing that's always existed, that same thing keeps on existing. You don't have to say all these like names for A, B, C, D, and the orders and the metrics and stuff. So we think just adding extra laws doesn't help either. So we think that basically everything we looked at in the previous section about laws and rationalism and essences and this non-Humean, none of that works either, because all of these are distinct. So none of the things work. We think basically the only thing that works is what we talked about at the very beginning of the video in terms of postulating this view anti-Hexaetism. So consider the normal world and the swap world. They're qualitatively identical. So that just means if you look at all the qualitative facts, they're the same. So here the qualitative facts will be something like there are infinitely many particle slices. They each have such and such mass. They each have such and such velocity, and et cetera, et cetera. But you'll never say things like particle slice A or particle slice B. So all of these facts between the normal world and the swap world are the same. And anti-Hexaetism will just like assert that there's only one world here. what anti-excitism says by definition is that there can't be two worlds that are qualitatively the same yet distinct. And so just sort of by fiat, anti-excitism solves the problem. So yeah, anti-excitism solves the problem. If you have anti-excitism and perdurantism, you get full laws, end of story. Okay, so then there's a question of like, to see how plausible of a response this is, basically all turns on how plausible you think anti-excitism is. And that's obviously a huge philosophical discussion for which many things have been written on. I think one thing to say is like the counterexample I mentioned at the beginning of like it seems like there's two possibilities, either you will die or your twin will die. There's also, so the anti-excitist has to say for any qualitative possibility, there's only one way you can like fill in individuals like A, B, C, D, whatever to realize that qualitative possibility. And that just seems like to cry out for explanation. Like why couldn't they swap? Like what's stopping them? Like why does it have to be exactly this order? So the anti-excitist seem to be committed to all of these metaphysical necessities. Like the only way to fill in this qualitative possibility is with A, B, C, D, and they have to be in this exact order and in this exact thing. And why can't they be different? You know, it's hard to say. So they seem to have to swallow all these like brute necessities. One way to get rid of all these brute necessities is to endorse qualitativism, where qualitativism is the view that, fundamentally speaking, there are no A, B, C, D, whatever. Fundamentally speaking, there's only qualitative facts. When we talk about like A, B, C, D, that's just like a useful way of humans to talk, but like the fundamental nature of reality is just a purely qualitative thing. And we think that's the best way to motivate anti-excitism because it would get rid of these brute necessities. It would still have the problem of like, it denies that there are two possibilities, like one where the meteor kills me and my twin. So it still faces the counterexamples. And whether qualitativism is true is like a very live debate in contemporary metaphysics. Yeah, some people have defended it. There's lots of problems for it, but yeah, can't really go into it here. But yeah, basically, seems to us that the only way for perdurantism to get full laws is anti-excitism. And the best way to motivate that is qualitativism, but that comes with lots of costs.
Yeah, no, that's good. And I guess the idea is that, again, we're assuming monism and you generalize to pluralism and basically the same thing is going to come up there. Yep. But we want to secure full lawfulness. And the endurantist has, a variety of different ways to do it by, they appeal to ontological inertia. And then there are some, reasonably plausible accounts of ontological inertia. But the perdurantist, on the other hand, seems to have to accept qualitativism, and that's very controversial. And there are some significant issues with it. So, this is where we're getting into some of the payoffs later on, which we'll briefly talk about. But before we do that, let's just briefly talk about how this stuff generalizes to pluralism. So yeah, I'll turn it over to you for that.
Yeah. So pluralism is just the view that there's more than just one thing, and there's like the most common pluralist views are views where there are like particles or points of space-time or something like that. And you can run all of these problems with particles or points of space-time. You can have a particle pop in and out, or space-time points swap locations, etc. Turns out for perdurantism, the situation is basically exactly the same. If you're an anti-excitist, then all of these swaps or whatever will be handled by anti-excitism. And it seems to us there's no other way out. So you could try to appeal to really complicated essences, but we think that's not really promising. So basically the exact same thing happens on perdurantism. If you accept anti-excitism, you get out of the problem, but that comes up with its own costs. With endurantism, things get a bit different. So the formulation of ontological inertia for monism was very straightforward. It just said the thing that exists keeps on existing. And things get much more complicated if you believe in things like particles or points of space-time, because you not only have to say like that they keep on existing, you have to say like how they keep on existing. So
yeah, like if they're here versus like over here.
Exactly. It's like, so take a world with two particles. If I just say things that have existed always will exist, it's consistent with that these two particles just like immediately swap places and keep on going. So you don't want that, because that would be a violation of determinism. It would be like on one view they keep on going, on one view they instantaneously swap places. So you have to be much more precise in your view. I think a natural thing is something like they continue on like continuous trajectories or something like that. That would get rid of this like swap thing. But then there's like interesting things of like what if the particles like cross paths? Then both would be continuous if they like bounce off, or if they like crossed as an X. And so it's a really interesting question, like are there these two possibilities where the particles like bounce off and where they like go in an X, and you have to say exactly how they endure. So that's one complication. So yeah, so it becomes more tricky in a pluralist setting. Another complication is that a lot of physical theories say that particles aren't conserved, that particle number is conserved, that particles can come into existence or go out of existence. So in like Newtonian cases, that's usually a case where like the same n particles like exist forever. But if you have like more complicated views where like particles go in and out of existence, then ontological inertia actually just won't help, because take a case, suppose there's n particles and a new n plus 1th particle comes into existence. There's a question of like, could it be that some other numerically distinct particle came into existence other than that particle? So in fact, particle A came into existence, but can we imagine that some other particle B, came into existence instead of particle A? So if you think that, yeah, particles can, different numbers of them go in and out of existence, then actually things get much harder, and ontological inertia actually won't give you it. And it's unclear actually what will give you it. So things get more complicated there. Also, the dialectic of all the options for explaining ontological inertia changes a bit. So the main one is like the Hume's dictum non-humanism one changes. Like in the case of monism, you can say, oh, there's only one enduring thing. There's no necessary connections between wholly distinct things. But if you believe in like tons of particles and the particles are causally interacting, then there are necessary connections between like the distinct particles and how they cause each other to move around. So that motivation applies in the monistic case, but not in the pluralistic case. So basically, to sum up, like it's much easier to defend full lawfulness in monistic setting than a pluralistic setting, both for technical reasons of actually formulating the principle, and what do you say about these X cases? Cases where particles come in and out of existence, ontological inertia actually won't even help. And then some of the motivations for ontological inertia don't work in the pluralist case, like the Hume's dictum case. So basically, it's much easier to get full lawfulness on monism than pluralism. And we think that's really interesting fact.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. So yeah, I mean, now we're sort of bridging into the conclusion. So like for the endurantist, you basically, as you were just explaining, it's like endurantism is exerting pressure for you to go towards a monistic view, because we want to secure full lawfulness. That's kind of the overarching goal.
Yeah.
And like some of the ways of doing that are not applicable under pluralism. Some of them you're losing some of the motivations that you had for like the ontological inertia, and in the case of monism, and you lose those in the case of pluralism. It seems much more complicated. You have to add more bells and whistles in the case of pluralism. So like there's pressure that endurantism is exerting on people to be monists, which is a significant result, right? Because like if you then have reason to think that monism is false, then you might have reason to think that endurantism is false. And similarly, the perdurantists aren't out of the weeds, because perdurantism, right, as we just kind of talked about maybe 5 or 10 minutes ago, there's a lot of pressure on perdurantists because of these problems, or because of these this discussion in your paper, to accept qualitativism, and that is that's tricky business, because it's an objectionable view. So yeah, I mean, if you want to talk a little bit more about the payoffs.
Yeah, I think this is kind of a hard paper to go through, because there's not like we approve X or something like that. It's the main goal is just like there's all these really interesting connections between all these metaphysical views that people really haven't appreciated, between like monism and pluralism, between persistence, between anti-excitism, qualitativism, and the distinctions between monism and persistence and everything. So yeah, there's all these really interesting metaphysical connections that people haven't appreciated between all of these views, which we think is a really cool way to try to make progress, because you can, if you have antecedent commitments like against monism or for qualitativism or for particle number being conserved, blah, 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 you can like import those to your favorite view here, which is cool. But I think in terms of like trying to draw out like concrete consequences, I think the main thing to draw out is if you're a perdurantist, you're forced to be an anti-excitist / qualitativist. And sort of the contrapositive of that is especially interesting. So anyone who denies anti-excitism or denies qualitativism should be an endurantist. And that's like a huge deal, because there's tons of people who don't like qualitativism who are not endurantists. So that's, I think, a really big conditional claim. Another one is that endurantism gives you some pressure to be a monist. That's also a huge claim, because most endurantists are not monists, and a lot of people don't like monism. So maybe if a fixed point for you is clearly monism is false, then maybe you should reductio and think maybe you should be a perdurantist qualitativist or something. So that's another really interesting conditional from endurantism to monism. There's another thing we didn't really talk about, but I think is super interesting in the paper between. So I started by saying there are these two models for how things persist, for perdurantism, endurantism, and there's these two models for the nature of time, like time is like space or time is not like space, and there's a privilege present. And there's probably the biggest objection to the view that there's a privilege present, etc., is this problem of there's no absolute simultaneity, that relativity says that yeah, for any two events that are spatially far apart, there could be no fact of the matter, but whether they happen at the same time or different times. And that's supposed to be a problem for the view that there's a privilege present. And we actually argue in our paper that we try to give some independent motivation for there being absolute simultaneity. So, so a lot of what are called A-theorists who think that there's this privilege present, a lot of them just sort of stipulate, okay, it turns out we just have to believe in absolute simultaneity, but just to save our view, we don't really have any independent motivation for that. But I think that if you're a non-qualitativist, which most people are, then you'll be an endurantist. And we think that any of the endurantist views that we offer actually lead to a privileged notion of simultaneity. In the monistic case, it's kind of easy to see that if there's a three-dimensional universe that exists and endures through time, then that universe itself will provide a standard of simultaneity. And there's something a bit more complicated in the pluralist case. We think that if you believe that space-time points endure through time, then that's also going to naturally lead to absolute simultaneity. So we think that within our paper, there's actually also independent reason to go in for absolute simultaneity, which is maybe the biggest objection to these views that posit a privilege present. So anyway, so those are some of the mixed conclusions of the paper.
Yeah, no, I mean, pretty significant payoffs, which is why, I mean, I hope more people can read the paper and get interested in this sort of stuff, because it is intrinsically fascinating, as you pointed out at the beginning, but also many significant interrelationships here and significant conclusions and opportunities for different people to do different reductios on different views, depending on which positions they want to fix on. So that's interesting. All right, well, that is going to have to do it. Thank you, David, so much for coming on and talking about your paper. Again, everyone, link is in the description, both to David's paper and his papers more generally. You can find that on his website, which I have linked in the description. I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope you guys got something out of it. If you enjoyed the work that I do, if you enjoy my channel, please hit that like button, turn on subscribe, turn on that little bell for notifications. Unfortunately, YouTube doesn't give you guys the videos that you want to see. So if you enjoy my videos, please turn on that little bell and consider supporting me on Patreon. Thank you guys so much to all of my existent patrons. And yeah, much love. Let me know what you think about this video in the comment section. And as always, peace out. Okay, let me stop record.